Today's a very special day for our center because the presentation today is being given by our 2025 Wayne Vucinich Fellow. This is the most prestigious fellowship that we give, named after one of the founders of the center, Professor Wayne Vucinich, Uncle Wayne, and the fellowship is intended to bring into our midst a promising young scholar of the region and from the region, and this year we're very happy to have as our Vucinich Fellow Dr. Grigoryev. He recently completed his PhD in social anthropology at the University of Helsinki with a dissertation titled Collective Memory of Modern Dagestanis about the local heroes of the Russian Civil War, Heroic Narratives and Ethnic Identity. Dr. Grigoryev is the recipient of research fellowships at the Alexandria Institute, the University of Helsinki, and also at Krika, which is our counterpart center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Since 2017, he has been conducting ethnographic research on collective memory, nationalism, and identity formation in the North Caucasus, focusing on the interplay between oral historical narrations and social dynamics in Dagestan, particularly surrounding the Russian Civil War period. And that's what we'll be talking about with us today. So please join me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Amir, Yovan, John and Mary Grace and all of Greece for this opportunity to work here and to share my research. Special thanks go to Pat and Martin for kindly offering me a place to stay, making my daily commute to Stanford short and pleasant. And it is, of course, a great honor to be a Wayne Vucinich Fellow. I will be around here until the end of June, and I'm happy to meet with any of you. So today I'm going to talk about how heroic narratives from the Russian Civil War period reveal ethnic identities and societal tensions in modern Dagestan. I'm a social anthropologist, which means that generally I'm interested in collective identities. More specifically, my primary research interest is in how people imagine their past and, even more importantly, how they use their past. So here are two strong statements which I believe capture my approach in the most condensed manner. It's all about the usability of the past in the present and treating past as a resource that is limited, that is valuable, and that is very often contested. And so it happened that my field is a place called Dagestan. So before diving into specific narratives, let me orient you with essential background that shapes contemporary Dagestan. And there will be a lot of background, so hopefully I'll have time to get to my research. Okay, let's talk geography first. Dagestan is the southmost republic of Russia, as you can see. It is washed by the Caspian Sea in the east and borders Chechnya, which is more known, in the north, Azerbaijan in the south, and is separated from Georgia by the Great Caucasus Mountains in the west. As you can see from the physical map, most of Dagestan is covered with mountain ridges. And at the same time, there is this strip of land that goes along the Caspian Sea, which can be called flatlands. This strip of land is very important because, once again, as you can see from the map, it connects the Eastern European plain with, well, essentially Middle East. So, unsurprisingly, this dramatic terrain of Dagestan made a huge impact on its social landscape. So, let's have a look at people who live there. Now, I realize you might not be able to see all the writings on those ethno-linguistic maps, but the point here is that draw a lot of ethnic groups. So, the size of Dagestan, it is roughly the size of Scotland or Estonia, which is 8 times, I just learned yesterday, 8 times smaller than California. So in this place that's 8 times smaller than California. You've got 3 million people approximately. But what's interesting, there are more than 30 languages. I'm not talking dialects, I'm talking proper languages, and at least 15 ethnic groups. Today, however, I will focus on only 3 ethnic groups, and those are Kumyks, Dargins, and Avars. So I suggest we look at the major regions that are associated with those 3 ethnic groups. So flatlands, once again, going along the Caspian Sea, quite a narrow strip of land. And the flatlands were historically dominated by Kumyk people. Those are Turkic-speaking people of Dagestan. But after the 20th century, Kumyks became a minority on the flatlands due to natural processes of urbanization, because obviously you would build cities on the plains, not in the mountains, and Soviet national policies. And also on the flatlands, you obviously got the 2 biggest cities of Dagestan, Makhachkala, which is the current capital, and Derbent, which I think is believed to be the oldest city on the territory of Russian Federation. Then you've got highlands. So those are historically isolated village communities. Highlands, for this reason, have the highest level of ethnic diversity, and due to urbanization and once again Soviet national policies, some resettlements, many mountain villages were abandoned, and lots of people from the highlands, the highlanders, now live on the plains. And then we've got foothills, although still mountains, kind of, sort of in between the highlands and the lowlands, and that's Dargin people. There you will find the old capital of Dagestan, Timirkhan Shura, which is now known as Buynaksk. Dargin people were quite successful at being politicians and heads of Dagestan in Soviet period, so they have better infrastructure and generally more wealth than people in the highlands. So another thing about geography is that East, Caspian Dagestan, and South Dagestan, which is a separate region I'm not going to talk about today, those regions are generally more historically or more open to the outside world and sort of had more complex political structures. But speaking about the outside world, let's talk history. Okay. So to oversimplify, 2 big periods, before 19th century and after 19th century. As I said, Dagestan is mountains, and then this narrow strip that connects East Europe and Middle East. And so because of that narrow strip, which is a natural route, trade route, but also important way of getting from one place to another, Dagestan has been in the scope of interest of larger states. So Arabs were there, Mongol hordes went through there, various post-Golden Horde polities were interested in this area. Ottoman Empire and Persia were interested too. None of the big just want to ask one thing. Mary, Grace. Okay. I'm just wondering if that's the correct presentation, but that's fine, they are not too different. Anyway, none of the big polities wanted Dagestan as a thing in itself. They wanted it as a place through which they wanted to pass. So Dagestan generally before the 19th century and after, it's a patchwork of, in the mountains especially, isolated village communities with minimal external control, they call themselves individualistic, so individualistic villages. Also an interesting thing, anthropological thing I guess about Dagestan, that Dagestanis are very endogamous. That means they marry inside their villages, which is very different from all other republics and ethnic groups in the North Caucasus. So that adds to individuality and autonomy. Highlanders, because you can't grow enough crops in the highlands, obviously, were not only cattle breeders, but they also did a lot of raids on the flatland settlements. So Kumyks, Turkic speaking, in the east, and Georgia, which is in the west. Right. Okay, and then what happened next? Russian Empire happened next. So Russia was interested in the North Caucasus since, you could say, since at least 16th century. It wasn't very successful back then. Peter the Great, you've probably heard of his Persian campaign in 18th century. It wasn't very successful. But since 19th century, Russia's efforts in the North Caucasus became more focused, systematic, and eventually successful. So 19th century for North Caucasus is what's known as the Caucasian War, and the most famous leader of anti-Russian resistance is Imam Shamil, a Highlander. However, it is important to note that Shamil, the leader of anti-Russian resistance, was fighting other Dagestani communities as much as he was fighting the invading Russian Empire, because Shamil was interested in creating this unified Sharia state there, and not all the communities were interested in having outside authority, even if that authority was Islam. So then you've got 20th century Russian Civil War, and I'll talk about it later, Soviet period. Compared to other republics of the Soviet Union, you could say that Dagestan was relatively stable. There was huge economic and infrastructural development, and of course there was religious suppression. Post-Soviet period, religious revival, conflict spillover from Chechnya. But what's important for me is narratives and attitudes. So what is the attitude of Dagestanis towards being controlled by Moscow? Again, to oversimplify, I saw both during my interviews and in written documents, two grand narratives. One, let's call it loyalist, conciliatory loyalist narrative, and the other one is a heroic resistance narrative. So the loyalist narrative is linked with nostalgia for the Soviet era, which was, as I already said, quite a good time for most Dagestanis. And you might have heard of this ideology, the friendships of people. So it's, the inertia of this Soviet ideology is still very strong. And sometimes loyalty to Russia seems even to sound more important than loyalty to Islam. Then you've got heroic pro-independence narrative on resistance. Obviously a resistance to Russia, right? Well, it's a bit complicated. So what's interesting about most heroic resistance narratives, doesn't matter if it's, about contemporary days or the past, I never saw any ideas of defeat or submission in those. So, that Dagestan was conquered in the 19th century, it stayed within the Russian state, the Soviet state during the 20th century. In the 90s, still Dagestan was firmly part of Russia. It is still a part of Russia, which is, doesn't go along with this idea that there was never a defeat, never a conquest, never a submission. But there wasn't. To illustrate this idea, so you see this painting, you can find it in the Dagestani capital in a museum, and at some point, and it's called Captured Shamil, that is the leader of anti-Russian resistance, basically the end of the Caucasian War. So yeah, it's called Captured Shamil, but there were renovations at that museum, and the picture, this painting was taken down. And then the renovations were done, and the painting was put up on the wall again. And strange thing happened because it was renamed. It was called Shamil negotiating with Vucinich. There's a big difference there, right? It's not just, capture means defeat, right? And negotiations doesn't really mean defeat. Could be, but not really. But also, look at the temporal aspect here, because captured is perfect, it's done. Like, this is it. Dagestan is not free. Negotiating is, English grammar, because I have to study it. It's present continuous. It's going on. It's still going on. Shamil is kind of still negotiating. So what I noticed, this interesting temporal aspect of heroic resistance narratives, is that they are kind of frozen in the moment of most glorious dramatic resistance to Russia, that is, like an hour before that. And then nothing happens, it's just frozen there. It just stays as heroic resistance, and hence, I spoke to people who are very much displeased with local or Russian government, but they never talked about, as I said, defeat, being submitted, or, that we should resist. Exactly because, the resistance is a thing in itself that is frozen in time and that is recognized, and we are undefeated. Interestingly, though, some Dagestanis may follow both of these two narratives, delicately weaving the idea of loyalty to Russia and independence from Russia in the famous phrase of the most celebrated Dagestani poet Rasul Gamzatov. So the saying is, Dagestan has never voluntarily entered Russia and will never voluntarily leave it. And then there is this interesting inversion associated with it, where metropoly-colony relationship is swapped, reversed, and Dagestan becomes the center, while Central Russia becomes its periphery, because the logic goes like this, So you Russians really want us to be a part of your state, so, now you pay us. So basically, and Dagestan is a donation economy, so I don't know what an economist, but I think like 80% of Dagestani budget, the budget of Republic of Dagestan, comes from Moscow. And yeah. Okay, but especially in Islamic world, it's really hard to separate what we call religion from social landscape and politics. So let's talk religion. Islam came to Dagestan as early as 7th century. However, it took 12 centuries for it to properly penetrate all the communities there. And hence, the Shamil unification project in 19th century, because very many local traditions on the brink of pre-Islamic beliefs. Nowadays, it's a very religious region, Sunni Islam with strong Sufi tradition. Sufi tradition is a mystical tradition. Once again, to oversimplify, there are many Sufi schools, tariqas, and it's once again very complicated, but generally speaking, it means veneration of sheikhs, kind of living saints, and also veneration of the ziyarats, which are the tombs of the sheikhs. And there is a Muftiat, previously known the Department for Religious Affairs of Dagestan. That is an official government religious overseeing institution that is supposed to oversee all of religion, all of Islam in Dagestan, not all of religion, Islam. Interestingly, though, this institution was created in 1944 by Joseph Stalin, and this tradition actually goes back to 18th century, creating those overseeing institutions. So the Muftiat, it's not just penetrated by FSP, it's basically so close to FSP, it's super loyal to Moscow. On the other hand, you had the growth of Wahhabi and Salafi movements. Once again, those are oversimplifications since the 1990s. However, today you'll struggle to find people who call themselves Salafi due to Russia's efforts, because lots of people who supported radical Salafi teaching went to ISIS and well, not many of them returned. Salafism and Wahhabism is officially banned in Dagestan. But as I said, it's not a major thing. When it comes to general population, at least in my experience, most people in Dagestan, they don't support neither Wahhabi or Salafi teachings or Muftiyat because it's too loyal to Moscow. And back to ethnic dynamics and tensions. So I already talked about highlands and lowlands. So there is a tension between those two areas and people who live there. I already mentioned not natural, but the process of urbanization, which led to highlanders going to the plains and settling there. And if we talk about stereotypes and how the highlanders, Avars primarily, see other ethnic groups and vice versa. So if you look at Avars, both positive and negative stereotypes of them are something in the area of, warrior-like, uncompromising, noble, aggressive. If we talk about Dargins, who live in the footlands in between, they are viewed as very diplomatic, as mediators, traders, pragmatic. So I guess those are positive stereotypes that the groups have about themselves. Kumyks, Turkic speaking on the plains, they see themselves as sophisticated, educated, and historically influential, but now marginalized. But if we talk about negative stereotypes, the highlanders of ours see Kumyks as spiritually and physically weak, and also alien because they are Turcophone. So, they speak they're from a very different language family. Avars, Highlanders, see Dargins as corrupt and, I just learned a new word today, avaricious. Yeah, so the saying is Dargins, when they have to do their prayer, they don't pray towards Mecca, they pray towards the nearest back branch. Dargins in the footlands see Avars as primitive, aggressive, and boastful, and Kumyks, lowlanders, see Avars and Dargins as primitive and answering the accusations of being alien because of their Turkic origin. They call them artificially created by Soviet national policies, which is kind of true because there were much more, actually like 16 ethnic groups that were united and called Avars. But anyway. So all in all, Dagestan, is it a nice place? Is it a stable place? Do you want to go there? And there are a lot of things, there are a lot of newspaper titles, they would say it's a highland stable place, the most dangerous place in Russia, I think there was a BBC article, something like that. You've got ethnic conflicts, you've got religious conflicts, so Wahhabi are not many, but bombings, terror attacks, they happen every couple of months. There is lots of poverty, unemployment, nepotism, corruption, highish birth rates, so lots of young people who have nowhere to go. Lots of state violence, staged military operations when authorities the military goes in the mountains, shoot at the mountain and get medals, but maybe some people die in the process. And business conflicts in Dagestan are also quite often solved through assassinations. And recently, COVID pandemic, so there is this idea that Russia had the most fatalities during COVID, and inside Russia, Dagestan had the most fatalities during COVID. So, in a way, it's very unique, but it's also very Russian when it comes to social maladies. But here is a paradox. You could also say that Dagestan is very stable, because ethnic conflicts, yes, but on the other hand, you've got ethnic equilibrium. None of the ethnic groups dominates Dagestan. So if one ethnic group tries to, do something harsh, all other ethnic groups would kind of suppress it. Individualism of villages is kind of acknowledged and respected. So, there are conflicts, but villages are generally left alone. Putin trusts Dagestan. He went there in 1999 during the Chechen Wars. He returned there 20 years later, and to celebrate the heroism of Dagestanis. Right after Grigoryev mutiny, probably a very scary point for Putin. the first thing he does, he goes to Dagestan, obviously a PR thing where he, shows that he's a leader, he's supported, and he chooses Dagestan. You won't go to a very unstable place after such a thing. Or just read Ivana Kulishev's book. It's a brilliant book, and the title kind of says it all. Right, so finally I can get to my research, I think. From 2016 till 2021, I went to Dagestan, I recorded interviews, I lived side by side with people in various villages. I talked with common farmers, cultural activists, professional historians, and as I said, being a social anthropologist, for me, academic works of professional historians are as valuable and as valid as the wildest conspiracy imagination of a truck drivers. But I couldn't go to Dagestan just asking about ethnic conflicts. That's not very sensible. It's a sensitive topic, and I couldn't just go there asking about, what happened in your village, just in general, asking about history. So I had to find a frame, and the frame was Russian Civil War. That was luck and chance, but retrospectively, I realized that it was a good choice. Why? So Russian Civil War, roughly 100 years ago. Why is it a good choice to talk about it, to use it as a reference point? No personal trauma. Unlike, for instance, Chechen Wars or 1990s, the collapse of Soviet Union. Also, it's already kind of sort of history, so it's a safe space of history. You can wield your sensitive views, dangerous views in the wheel of historicity. Also, Civil War, it's a fracture in the fabric of history. It allows you to, it's a collapse, something's gonna happen, and hence, from this fracture come out all sorts of actors, all sorts of ideas, what's the historical past, who are we, what do we want? So you can speak about Civil War, you can speak about other periods of history or in the future. So it is, I quite like this, both Chronos and Kairos could be translated as time, right? But Chronos is chronological time and Kairos is this special moment, as I said, a fracture in the fabric of history. Let's skip this one. And so, Russian Civil War in the Caucasus, once again, context, really briefly, lots of very interesting things happen. Absolutely amazing field for a historian to study, but briefly, so you've got Islamic conservatives, just to reiterate, Russian Civil War plus First World War plus ethnic diversity plus all these Sufi schools with different ideas, it's a mess. But to simplify, you've got Islamic conservatives who wanted an independent Sharia state. You've got Mountainous Republic, a very weak state that kind of existed for a couple of years, didn't control anything really. You've got Islamic modernists, so-called peaceful sheikhs, that were leaning towards Bolsheviks and socialists, but generally tried to stay out of it. No political project. And of course, you've got local Bolsheviks and socialists. And so socialists, they were there, but they were mostly in the underground. From 1917 till 1920, they didn't do much. Nobody controlled Dagestan really from 1917 till 1920. They were just in the underground, as I said. Democrats were weak. In 1919, there was a party that controlled Dagestan almost for a year. It was the White Movement, Volunteer Army of General Anton Denikin. They controlled Dagestan for somewhat less than a year. And then they left because they had other fish to fry. They had to go to Moscow and try to unsuccessfully capture it. And then Bolsheviks just rolled in, no major resistance. There were, of course, external actors, well, obviously, Bolsheviks and the White Movement. Interestingly, there was also Ottoman Empire, was on the brink of ceasing to be Ottoman Empire and even British Empire. However, both of those actors, they were not really interested in Dagestan. They were interested in Baku, in the oil fields. However, they kind of appeared in Dagestan, tried to do something there, and disappeared. But it's important because those two actors, Turkey and British Empire, are in the narratives of the Dagestanis. And finally, I can get to my research. So, as I said, I went to villages. I concentrated on the frame of the Russian Civil War, but not just on the frame of the Russian Civil War. I knew that I chose several heroes, 5 of them, I'm going to talk about 3 of them, who were born in particular villages. And that's where I went. So the first village, the village Gatsov, and it's the birthplace of Najmudin Gatsinsky. So Highlands, Najmudin Gatsinsky was a Highlander. He was a military aristocrat. His father served the Russian Empire. He was very wealthy. And during Civil War, he was part of and you could even say ahead of this conservative Sharia bloc. Unlike many other leaders, he was quite uncompromising, and he went to the end. So, his fight, his idea, not just his idea, but anyway, his idea of independent Sharia state didn't really work out. And then in the 1920s, it was quite obvious. In the 1920s, it was quite obvious that Bolsheviks had won, but still he fought until 1925, even though he knew that he was doomed. In 1925, he was captured and executed along with his family. So here are some quotes from the interviews. And this is all about the connection between the past and the present. So Avar sees himself as noble warriors who refuse to compromise. They might not be as rich or as successful as other ethnic groups, but they are noble. Najmuddin, according to modern-day Dagestani, would have named a Wahhabi right now. And Wahhabi, I think I forgot to say it. So in reality, in practice, there are a lot of Wahhabis in Dagestan, according to, the forces loyal to Moscow. Why? Because, say you've got a neighbor and you want his land. So you just call FSB and you say that, he's a Wahhabi. FSB comes in, burns down the house of your neighbor, and drops a rifle and some extremist literature next to the burned house. FSB gets medals, promotions, whatnot. You get the land of your neighbor. So that's how lots of conflicts are solved in Dagestan. So Wahhabi means somebody who is not very happy with the current regime. So yeah, that's why this hero would have been called Wahhabi today. And this hero, along with the whole of Avars, they were betrayed by Dargins and Kumyks who sold out Dagestan, whose heroes didn't fight Bolsheviks. The interesting problem here is that, as I said, this leader, Najmudin Gatsinsky, he was very wealthy, probably one of the wealthiest men in Dagestan. He was also a poet, quite a good poet, they say. But the ideal image of an Avar person is a very poor, very strong, very noble, maybe a bit primitive, but very noble person. So that's a problem. So how do informants solve it? It's quite interesting. They talk about that he wasn't fighting for his wealth. That's what Bolsheviks claim, that he was fighting for his wealth. No, he fought until the end. He didn't compromise. Okay, he was rich, but he didn't compromise. He fought until the end. He knew that he's gonna die. He knew he's gonna lose his riches. He knew his family is going to be killed. He knew he would be killed. So basically, he sacrificed himself. So how can you accuse a person who sacrificed not just his wealth, but all of his family and his own life? How can you accuse this person of being, a fancy, fat, greedy cattle breeder. That's how the Soviet propaganda called. So the vows of Nashmutin is just one of the aspects is solved through this narrative of sacrifice. Another hero, Luby Buinovsky, lowlands. You can even see the Caspian Sea there, picture. Kumyks. So, an educated aristocrat, although kind of disadvantaged because he was the youngest son and he was from the second marriage with a common woman. Anyway, he was a very young man and he died a very young man, and he was educated at Moscow State University, where he was very much engaged in the stuff that was going on among the students at that time during the and before the Russian Civil War. So he's called the leader of the Bolsheviks in Dagestan during the Revolution Civil War. I'm not entirely convinced that he was truly a leader because he didn't do much, to be honest. He did create a newspaper and he probably was the only author there. And he was caught in 1919 by forces loyal to Denikin, the white movement. He was caught and he was shot. Even though he didn't do much, this is actually great for myth making. And it doesn't matter if you are, creating this narrative, a mythic narrative for the Soviets or for, Kumyk nationhood or, some Islamic ideas, because since he didn't do much, you can ascribe lots of things to him. He's very flexible. So, Soviets created this ideal martyr out of him. He fought for the Bolshevism, he was killed. And what's interesting is that this village, it's a very religious village. I don't like those words. I mean, they're obviously very loaded and complicated, but it's a very much fundamentalist village. It's, lots of people in Dagestan call it the Wahhabi village. You can see there is a huge mosque, maybe you can see in the center of this village being built, and it's a very successful economically too. But next to this huge mosque, you've got this also huge museum to a Dagestani Bolshevik. And that's the problem because, you've got the leader of Bolsheviks, the leader of people who brought atheism, and the mosque, and how do you combine those? And people there combine it. So they say because he didn't participate in anti-religious campaigns of the Soviet Union because he was dead by then, he was actually fighting for just general freedom. And more so, if you look at the program of socialists and communists, it's a program that is very close to ethics of Islam. And also, there is this quite wild narrative about that it was Kumyks who made the revolution possible. And Soviet Union is a project that was created by them. And more so, there is this idea of a great state that goes from Urals to Istanbul, of a Turkic state. I'll wrap up. So I've got another hero for you. Foothills in between. So Sharia judge Ali Haji Akushinsky, diplomacy and compromise. This person, he communicated with everyone. He eventually associated himself with Bolsheviks, and once again, a problem. You've got a religious person, you've got a religious leader, a Sharia judge, but you would ask people from that village why, isn't that wrong? Your religious leader being a pawn of Bolsheviks. And the solution is that people in Dagestan know about the deportation of Chechen people and some other people during the Soviet period. And they say that Ali Gaji, their leader, he foresaw what's going to happen, and he foresaw that Dagestan, all of Dagestan, would be, genocided or deported. And that's why he decided to sacrifice not just himself, but sacrifice his reputation and ally himself as Bolsheviks. And with this sacrifice, he saved Dagestan from deportations. Right, I'll probably come to this is the conclusion. So, to conclude, our people in this particular village claim moral purity through a uncompromising stance of their wartime leader. The Dargin people claim to pragmatic wisdom through flexible adaptation of their hero and also sacrifice. Kumyk people claim intellectual leadership through education and modernization that is associated with a hero. And those heroes of the civil war in Dagestan are not just historical characters known only to professional historians and residents of their native villages. The names of these people have become important reference points in Dagestan war days, and I'm talking about regular, everyday, common people, name of those names. Discussions about the roles of these people in the history of the region are frequent and always heated, precisely because these names are directly associated with conflicting ideas of different communities about religion, ethnicity, social order, and justice. The mention of these names inevitably leads a Dagestani to question, should Dagestan remain a part of Russia? Should the Muslims of Dagestan adhere to local Islamic traditions or follow the path of reforming Islam? Is there enough space in Dagestan for all ethnic communities living there now? These questions were important for the Dagestanis at the beginning of the 20th century, just as they are important now. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grigoryev, for this presentation. I just wanted to ask, what is the relationship of the local people who were your respondents to the questions of violence during civil war and today? How did they perceive violence? Are they afraid of violence? Are they afraid of eruption of violence? Or on the contrary, they seem a bit agitated about this whole
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. And actually, that reminds, I talked that with Yama, because it ties up to this idea that Dagestan is super unstable and yet very stable. And it reminds me of some anthropology lessons where we were shown those almost Stone Age societies that regularly two tribes, they go to war with each other, throw some spears. But if you really look, they try not to kill anyone. So, I think, if I think about most of my informants, there is this general agreement of all ethnic groups that great violence is bad. Hence, you shouldn't resist or, highly provoke Russia. Because, like you have business interests, you gotta kill this guy. That's one sort of violence, right? So minor violence is, well, it's there, I wouldn't say it's accepted, but it's kind of part of the everyday life. People talk about bombings and assassinations casually. But everyone is really, really cautious of, big violence. So people from one ethnicity would say absolutely horrible things about, the other ethnic groups, straightforwardly. And, I just met the informant and he just goes on around how, all of them should be. Yet, it never gets there, and it never got there. There were no huge, horrible mass killings of, one ethnic group against the other ethnic group. So there is this, feel for that, mass violence is, something everyone's trying to avoid that. But at the same time, you've got this Highlander kind of all this wrestling and, you shouldn't hold a pen, don't be a girl, don't study. I mean, especially, I'm just quoting some of our informant, you gotta fight, But this is kind of a, not playful violence, but it's another very interesting topic, I guess, for gender studies, the masculinity in Dagestan.
Yeah, I'm curious. It kind of seems like the historical heroes were set up in opposition to the Bolsheviks, or that it seems, that they were separate from the Bolsheviks. So, in your discussions, was there a distinction between kind of the Russian Bolsheviks of the Civil War and the Soviet Union as something that Dagestanis supported, created, were a part of? I'm kind of curious about that divide.
That's also a very great question, because that's one of the rhetorical, tactics that many informants used when they, because there is this problem. Actually, lots of leaders, even religious leaders, supported Bolsheviks. How do you solve that? It's kind of wrong to say that. It's good for Louis Buynakski, who was killed in 1919. He didn't see any of it. But for instance, Olegaj Kushinsky, he died in 1930. So, he allied with Bolsheviks, but then when Bolsheviks were feeling pretty comfortable, they forgot about their alliances. They killed all the religious leaders who were still in Dagestan. They killed his associates, they killed his family. He died of old age, probably couldn't bear it. So that's what you do. You just say, initially, the whole Bolshevik project, they were for the poor. Islam is for the poor. We are for the poor. Why would we go against that, right? What happened later? Well, it was a betrayal. Some horrible people in Moscow, Kumyks would say that it was Avars who told Stalin to suppress Kumyks. So yes, there is this idea of separating those two periods, and it's useful.
I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your methodology, and in particular, how you identified your interlocutors, or I believe you've called them your informants, and how you identified them, but also what those initial encounters were like, and whether you experienced a difference with the different groups that you spoke with. Like your experience in getting integrated into their community to the extent that you did.
Well, I tried to be as passive as possible. So I had this person, once again to illustrate the that Soviet period was very beneficial for some Dagestanis, and absolutely amazing upward social mobility. A person from a very, very, even by Highlander standards, high up mountainous tiny village. He's now the head of Stone Age archaeology department in Moscow University. That's the only person I had, and then I just asked him to, he can tell me if there is any, he knows in Dagestan, and he said they're doing those excavations in Akusha village, and I just went there, and then it was snowballing. So, you gotta be integrated, you gotta be accepted by a certain family, and it's, once again, a horrible war, but, a very traditional society, and very well-connected societies. There are no credit banks in Dagestan because a Dagestani person has 500 phone numbers in his phone book, and he would just, get 2 million rubles if he needed it. So, there is this, even though there are those ethnic conflicts, there are connections, and everyone knows everyone, basically. So it was just, snowballing, and people introducing me to people. And I'm sorry, I'm not quite answering your question, but I said in the beginning, I tried to be passive because, there is this problem. I'm a Russian person, ethnic Russian person from St. Petersburg. And even though not straightforwardly, but I'm asking people of Dagestan about their attitude towards Russia. And, you know, the first question you would say is that, you know, like, what, how do you, they won't tell you the truth. And I decided that I'm going to use my passivity, because it's also interesting, how do you talk to a Russian person about Russian conquest? So I just allowed people to kind of, you know, families to move me from one family to another, and I observed how they tried to avoid the conflicts. And sorry, but yeah, I was just following what the informants told me to do, what my guides told me to do, and I was just quietly observing. And the most important thing, I think, is that it wasn't not just passivity, but silence, because talking is very unmanly, especially when you're in the highlands. Men are not supposed to talk. So sometimes you come to a village, they know why you're coming there, the family is expecting you, and you just don't talk for a week. And that's very important because, you know, some I think I've got it right, but some researchers just jump at informants asking questions, oh, what happened? You know, they don't talk to me for a week. I also don't talk, you know, just hello, goodbye. And then, after a week, people start talking.
And was it that you were party to sort of conversations that were happening in larger groups, like with families, or were these one-on-one interviews? And who typically spoke? Like, what was the profile of the person you were speaking with?
Mostly one-on-one. And as for families, once again, we discussed it because you're kind of like not allowed to look in the direction of a woman. It was mostly men. Or much older women.
Sure.
I'm just curious about like the impressions you mentioned briefly, the impression of like Turkey, Ottoman Empire, and England during the Civil War. So I'm just curious if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, there is. I'm just going to use this opportunity. One of the researchers, and there are not that many researchers in Dagestan, it's for people who study Dagestan, as an article dedicated to monarchism in Dagestan. And compares how Dagestanis speak positively about Gaddafi, who was the leader of the other guy, Saddam Hussein, and Putin, and some other Recep Erdogan, as if they were kind of, you know, very similar leaders, and this sort of leaders Dagestan really lacks and really needs. And speaking about British Empire, I think several informants, when talking about Russian Civil War, and as I said, there were like a couple armored cars in Dagestan. They just went in, they saw what's happening, and in 1919, it was a mess. They left. But in the imagination of this informant, speaking of historic past, Dagestan could have been a part of Great Britain. You know, and you know, is it good to be part of Great Britain, British Empire? Yes, because they've got monarchy. And that same informant actually, I might be mistaken, but he kind of compared Putin, British monarchs, and Gaddafi as, you know, a line of proper leaders that we really need. So there is this kind of, yeah. And as for Turkey, obviously it's very popular and very liked among Kumyks who are Turkic speaking. And, you know, yeah. With others, it's not so much.
Great. So thank you for an excellent talk. I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, so I have the impression that what you're describing is an environment in which very localized communities are kind of reinterpreting their own pasts mostly along kind of ethnic collective lines. And I guess it's raises lots of interesting questions that you've addressed already, but I wonder about what that project might help us understand about a kind of official Dagestani state project. For example, is there, or can you identify inroads from, say, schooling, from textbooks, from the production of scholarship? I mean, I was just very far away from the Kachola, but scholars in the Kachola are doing a lot of, as you know, a lot of historical work from, kind of fields of archaeology all the way to, this period and then the recent past, right? So it's obviously a rich kind of Soviet-rooted historical tradition, right, on top of others. But so is that, are these communities engaging at all with the kind of, if you like, the kind of highbrow historical thinking, or if one thinks of what's happening in schools, or if one thinks too presumably in the world of television, right? And thinks of projecting from other parts of the the space broadly, but it seems to me that in lots of places formerly connected to the Soviet Union, one can have conversations about history which seem to be informed by very close engagement with media discussions, beginning with the Perestroika era and all the publication of documents and commentary upon the news secrets, and kind of popular journals addressing new documents, new evidence, new narratives. And then, of course, it seems to be a feature of a kind of, cultural life based on television and maybe radio. So are any of those projects intersecting with this? And I guess, is this a way to evaluate the state of the project, maybe we identify in the Muftiate or just in religious circles that are kind of unifying Dagestan and creating a kind of pan-ethnic or supra-ethnic Dagestani state identity? Is that what we identify in kind of formal official institutions? It seems to me maybe, from what I can tell, clerics are involved in this to an extent, but do you see these projects intersecting? Are they working across purposes, or is that all just kind of existing in the ether, or is this really where people are thinking about the past and how it connects to the present and who people are?
Great, thank you. Yeah, this previous speaker asked if I have 2 hours. So what people locally call their individualism, I think there's this fancy word, parochialism? Let's just call it individualism, is very strong. So I've never encountered any working supra-ethnic project. It wouldn't succeed. The most successful project of that sort was Imam Shamil, who tried to unify all of Dagestan under a banner of Islam. And by the 19th century, almost everyone was Muslim in Dagestan. But you go to a Kushu village, Dargin village, and they tell you, oh, Imam Shamil told us to join us, but we just, sent him to hell. That's how individual we are, that's how great we are. We go to Kumik village and they say, oh, actually the commander of Imam Shamil raided our village and killed our prince and took 2 of his sons prisoners. So, and that was the most successful project of Dagestan unification. So it doesn't work. It really doesn't work, unifying, creating some, Dagestani identity. And I think that's why Dagestan was relatively stable during the Soviet times, because in the 1920s, especially in the 1930s, Soviet Union sent dozens and dozens of ethnographers and linguists creating alphabets for the smallest languages, basically supporting this diversity, basically supporting every little small ethnic group. I'm not saying they had good intentions, maybe it was kind of divide and conquer thing, but the equilibrium held. And so, there is buildings of Dargin theater, of our theater in Makhachkala and other theaters. They have newspapers, so there is this inertia from the Soviet Union that is very strong, where even though the conflicts do exist, there is this kind of acknowledgement, there is diversity, and it's gonna stay this way, or it's gonna be really bad. Speaking of intellectuals, they produce historians, local historians produce amazing amounts of academic works which are not very academic, if I'm honest with you, and several informants stated quite clearly and openly, if your village wants to continue existing, every once in a while, every, I don't know, 20, 30 years, you pick a guy from your village, you send him to Makhachkala, or better yet to Moscow, to study as a historian. And then he got sponsored by some local village businessman, and the job of that historian is to write the history of Dagestan or the history of that ethnic group, proving that this village was the center of all Northern Caucasus since Stone Age, and everything that happened in human history that was important actually came from that village. And that's kind of a normal process, you know. And so you've got lots of historians who just basically work for their villages, promoting their villages, showing how Kumyks ruled the whole of North Caucasus forever, or Avars was the greatest forever. Yeah, and as for schools, very interesting. I really wanted to get into it, but as far as I can tell, the textbooks they're using are still textbooks from 1970s, 1980s. So what's happening in schools, God knows. I guess every history teacher decides what to. But I would bet that there is this huge Soviet inertia, not just because of the school books that are from the 70s, but because there is no narrative to replace the Soviet narrative.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question if there is one. Okay, well, in that case, please join me in thanking our speakers.